Nicolae Ceaușescu, the man who ruled Romania for 24 years with an iron fist, he thought nothing could shake his throne. But in just a few days, the people who lived in fear for years decided to say time of terror is over. In a scene they will never forget, history saw the dictator fall before the cameras and before the entire world. How did Ceaușescu rise from the pinnacle of power to the wall of execution? The question remains, how did the lives of an entire people change in a single moment? Ceaușescu, the capit, Nicolae Ceaușescu's name still strikes fear into the hearts of Romanians even today. Today, he came to power in 1965 as General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party, the only legal party in the country. He transformed it in 2.5 decades. He went from being a political leader to an absolute dictator who ruled an entire country in the name of socialism, but in reality, he turned it into a large, open prison. Ceaușescu was obsessed with complete control. He used the party tool to silence and monitor everything, and the police threat was his iron arm, and his spies were everywhere, in schools, offices, and even in homes. People were afraid to speak, even to their relatives, because any wrong word could mean arrest or something. The worst thing was that Romania was sinking into abject poverty and isolation from the world, while he and his wife, Ina, lived in luxury, with lavish palaces and limited extravagance, millions of dollars and gold in foreign banks, while the people were dying of hunger. But as they say, every tyrant has an end, and the end is always tragic. But how did Romania turn into this? The big prison. The answer lies in the way Ceaușescu used the Communist Party since he became General Secretary. The party was no longer just a political organization, but rather a massive tool of repression that penetrated every corner of society. Everything in the country was under the control of the party, the media, the judiciary, education, even the arts. But what's more dangerous is that making loyalty to the party a condition for survival, or even for obtaining a job or a loaf of bread. Then came the infamous secret police, the Securitate, a ruthless spy force operating under direct authority from Ceaușescu. They planted their agents in every neighborhood, every school, every institution, even within families. The result was that fear became a way of life, and silence became the only option for survival. Ceaușescu did not rule only by military force, but also by a mentality of total surveillance and strict discipline. On December 16, 1989, the spark began in the Romanian city of Timișoara. A Christian priest named Laszlo Tokaj dared to publicly criticize the regime and demand freedom of worship. Ceaușescu did not hesitate and immediately issued an order for his arrest. But the people of Timișoara said enough was enough, and they went to the police station, the streets to defend the priest and demand freedom. This was the first time Romanians had dared challenge the regime. Ceaușescu's response was brutal. As usual, he sent his soldiers and issued orders to kill them. Bullets rained down on the peaceful demonstrators, blood covered the streets, and screams pierced the sky. But what happened next was surprising. Instead of people panicking and returning to their homes, protests began to spread through Romania, from Timișoara to Cluj to Constanta, all the way to the capital, Bucharest. Music, the tyrant began to lose control, and the Romanians finally began to wake up from a nightmare that had lasted 25 years. On December 1, 1989, at 2 p.m., Ceaușescu stood on the balcony of the Central Committee headquarters in Bucharest. In front of more than 5,000 people in the square, he thought this public speech would broadcasting live, would restore his prestige. He thought it would show the world that the people still supported him, but he didn't realize that this speech would be his last appearance as dictator of Romania. He began his speech. As usual, his voice was booming, talking about the achievements of the regime and the people's love for him. The cameras were recording, and the chants were pre-recorded and broadcast over loudspeakers, so that it sounded like the audience was cheering him. But suddenly, a real voice emerged from the crowd. It wasn't applause or a cheer of support, but a scream of anger, the voice of the revolution. His wife, Ina, shouted as she grabbed his arm, "They're shooting." His bodyguard shouted, "They're entering the building." The cameras began to shake. The cameraman had clear instructions. If any emergency occurred, he should point the lens at the sky. But the voice did not stop. The voice of anger remained, the voice of the people who decided to break the chains of fear. Ceaușescu tried to complete the speech and promised to raise salaries. and pensions, but it was too late. The crowd downstairs began chanting, "Down with Ceaușescu! Ceaușescu! Down with the tyrant! Just a moment!" On live television, just a few minutes, it was enough for the empire of fear he had built over a quarter century to collapse. The situation was out of control. Thousands of demonstrators surrounded the building. The Central Committee broke down the doors and climbed the stairs. The goal was clear: to reach Ceaușescu. He was hiding in the emergency meeting room with senior officials. His face was pale, his eyes were filled with panic, and he shouted at his assistants, "Where's the pilot? I want the helicopter now." For the first time in his life, the man who had terrified an entire nation was afraid. His plan was clear: escape from the rooftop before the demonstrators arrived. A few minutes later, the sound of helicopters filled the sky over Bucharest. Ceaușescu and his wife, Iana, were surrounded by their guards. They ran to the rooftop, their faces covered in blood. Yellowing from terror and trembling, the pilot helped them climb as the voices of the protesters drew nearer. Anna cried loudly. Ceaușescu began shouting at the pilot, "Hurry! Hurry!" Then, at the last moment, the helicopter took off. The protesters reached the roof a few minutes later, only a few minutes later. But where would they go? The first stop was their palace in the Snegov suburb, north of the capital. There, Ceaușescu tried to contact the military leaders and ask for support and protection, but response was shocking. "Sorry, Mr. President, no one is coming to help. You are alone now." The army abandoned him. Even his closest associates decided the ship was sinking and it was time to jump. The pilot tried to convince them to leave again, this time heading west toward Tito's hometown, hoping they might find a loyal military unit, but they began to hear on the helicopter radio, "All aircraft are prohibited from flying. Any aircraft not identified ... identity will be dropped immediately. Options are over." The helicopter made an emergency landing on a road between Bucharest and Târgoviște. Ceaușescu and Elena, the two absolute rulers of Romania, were now fugitives. On the side of the road, unprotected, without power, without anything. The dictator who ruled with an iron fist for more than 2 decades now stood on the side of the road, waving his arm, trying to stop a car, a passing scene that seemed painfully ironic. A man who no one could approach now waits, the mercy of a stranger. Ceases, a small car driven by a bicycle mechanic named Nicolae Ceaușescu, who didn't know who these two people were. He saw an elderly man and woman asking for help. He agreed to drive them to the nearby city of Târgoviște, not realizing that history was sitting in the back seat. During the drive, the radio began broadcasting breaking news. "The regime has fallen. The revolution has triumphed." Bucharest was celebrating, and Anna sat there crying. Ceaușescu stared out the window in silence, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing, how everything had changed so quickly. How his empire had fallen in hours. The driver noticed their nervousness and suggested that they hide in an agricultural institute on the outskirts of the city. Perhaps they could find temporary shelter. They agreed immediately. But the director of the institute, upon seeing them, realized who they were. He didn't immediately reveal this. Instead, he led them to a side room, locked the door, and called the local police. At exactly 3:30 p.m. on December 19, 1989, the police arrived at the scene. Nicolae Ceaușescu and his wife, Ina, were arrested and immediately taken to a nearby military barracks in Târgu. There, not a lawyer was waiting for them, but a military tribunal. The new government had decided to conduct a speedy trial, with no room for delay. December 1989 was Christmas Day, but in Romania, it was not a day of celebration, but a day of trial for the most famous, a dictator in Eastern Europe, in his isolated military residence, created an extraordinary tribunal specifically for this day. Everyone in it was a military man. The judges, the lawyers, and even the atmosphere was strict and heavy, with no mercy. Ceaușescu and his wife, Ina, were charged with 3 devastating charges: genocide against the Romanian people, the deliberate destruction of the national economy, and then an attempt to flee with more than $1 billion of their money. The people sat Ceaușescu on a wooden chair. His hands were tied behind his back, his face bearing the same look he had held throughout his rule: defiance, arrogance, and denial. Even at that moment, he couldn't believe that it was over. He shouted in a loud voice as he stared at the judges, "I do not recognize this court. this illegitimate court. I am the elected president of Romania, but no one responded. The judge continued to read the charges in a clear, firm, unwavering voice. The witnesses stood one after the other, recounting the crimes of the regime, the effects of repression, and the voices of T.